All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a figure whose work has been sparking debate and, let's be honest, a fair bit of controversy for decades now. I'm talking about Frantz Fanon.
Frantz Fanon. He's one of those thinkers you can't just pin down with a single label. He was born in Martinique, but also very much a product of French education and culture. He was a trained psychiatrist who delved deep into the human mind, but he was also a passionate political philosopher and activist who threw himself headfirst into the Algerian Revolution. And on top of that, he was a prolific writer and journalist who saw the power of words as a weapon in the struggle for liberation.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. He wasn't just dabbling in these things, he was deeply engaged in all of them. And what's really interesting for our deep dive today is how his work has been interpreted and reinterpreted over time. We're going to be looking specifically at what's been called the second generation of Fanonian studies.
Right, so this second generation, it really starts gaining steam in the early 21st century. What these scholars are doing is they're revisiting Fanon's ideas, but they're looking at them through a new set of lenses. You can think of them as postmodernist and postcolonial lenses.
And just to break that down a bit for our listeners, postmodernism, it challenges a lot of those traditional ways of thinking about power structures and grand narratives. And post-colonial thought, it digs deep into how colonialism, even when it officially ends, continues to shape societies and individuals in really profound ways. It's about those lingering effects on identity, on language, on culture, on how people see themselves and the world around them.
It's like imagine a tree, right? Even after you chop it down, the roots are still there, under the surface. They can still influence what grows in that soil later on. That's kind of what post-colonial thinkers are getting at with Fanon.
I like that analogy. And so for this deep dive, we're going to try to understand why Fanon's work is still so relevant, so powerful, even decades after his death. We're still grappling with many of the issues he was writing about. Violence, racism, the rise of ethnic and religious tensions, all playing out on a global stage.
Absolutely. And to really get a handle on all this, we're going to be drawing from a really rich mix of sources. We've got biographies that offer very different portraits of Fanon the man. We've got deep dives into his core philosophical and political arguments. And we've got these contemporary reinterpretations that try to make his often challenging ideas speak to the issues we're facing today. So yeah, buckle up. It's going to be a fascinating ride.
So to kick things off, let's start with Fanon himself. Who was this guy, both as a person and as a thinker?
One really valuable starting point for understanding Fanon is the work of Alice Cherki. What makes her perspective so unique is that she actually knew Fanon personally.
Right, Cherki. She was an Algerian psychiatrist and psychologist, and she was deeply involved in the Algerian struggle for independence. So imagine this. She's working alongside Fanon in his psychiatric wards. She's part of his circle during this incredibly intense and pivotal period. Her insights come from that firsthand experience.
Exactly. And in her book, Frantz Fanon, Portrait, she paints this really vivid picture of him. She talks about his incredible presence, how he just commanded attention whenever he spoke. But it wasn't just charisma. She highlights his remarkable ability to connect these really big abstract ideas to practical action.
Like he wasn't just an armchair philosopher. He was driven to apply his ideas to the real world, to actually make a difference in the fight for liberation.
Exactly. And Cherki points out this fascinating thing about Fanon's use of language. You see, he was writing in French, the language of the colonizer. But he didn't just use it. He sort of reclaimed it, made it his own. He used this very flowery, almost poetic style, full of these vivid metaphors, often drawing from the body and the senses. It was a way of expressing himself that felt closer to spoken language than formal academic writing.
It's almost like he was taking the tools of the colonizer and turning them into instruments of resistance, of expressing this new Algerian identity that was being forged.
Exactly. And this ties into a core belief of Fanon's that Cherki helps us understand. He was convinced that true decolonization, true liberation, required a complete break from the colonial past. It wasn't enough to just achieve political independence. You had to create a new culture, a new national identity, free from the psychological baggage of colonialism.
It was about reclaiming not just land, but also the mind, the very way people saw themselves and the world around them.
Right. And this brings us to one of the most controversial and debated aspects of Fanon's work, his views on violence. Cherki emphasizes that, for Fanon, Violence in the context of colonialism wasn't something he glorified or saw as an end in itself.
It was a response.
Yeah, it was a response to the inherent violence of the colonial system. He saw it as a way of breaking free from that suffocating grip when all other avenues had been closed off.
And Fanon's thinking on this, it didn't develop in a vacuum. His ideas about violence as a tool for liberation were very much in line with the philosophy of Ramdana Bain.
Ah, yes, Ramdana Bain. He was a key figure in the FLN, the Algerian National Liberation Front. He was absolutely convinced that violence was the only language the colonizer understood. He had this famous and pretty chilling saying, "One corpse in a jacket is always worth more than 20 in uniform." It basically meant that targeting European civilians was a more effective strategy than attacking French soldiers.
So you can see how these ideas, as disturbing as they might sound to us today, were born out of this brutal reality of colonial oppression.
Right, and these ideas had a real impact. In 1956, at the Sumam Conference, which was this crucial meeting that shaped the direction of the Algerian Revolution, two of Bain's key principles were adopted.
And these were?
First, that the political leadership should always have primacy over the military. And second, that the internal resistance forces within Algeria were more important than those operating from outside the country.
So he was really advocating for a centralized political leadership and prioritizing the struggle within Algeria itself.
Exactly. But those very principles also put Bain on a collision course with some powerful figures within the FLN, particularly those in the military wing who wanted a more collective leadership structure where the army had greater say. Tragically, this clash led to Bain's assassination in Morocco in late 1957.
And according to Turkey, Fanon was deeply shaken by Bain's death. They weren't just political allies, they were close friends. And crucially, they shared a deep fear of what might happen in Algeria after independence, particularly the potential for the military to become the dominant force. Sadly, as history shows, those fears turned out to be prophetic.
Yes, and you can see this concern reflected in Fanon's writing, particularly in his powerful critique of the emerging African nationalist elite in the chapter The Pitfalls of National Consciousness from his book The Wretched of the Earth.
In that chapter, he's really scathing in his assessment of this new class of African leaders. He saw them as essentially a comprador bourgeoisie, meaning a class that was more interested in enriching itself through collaboration with Western interests than in genuine revolutionary transformation.
He argued that they were largely content to maintain the existing economic structures inherited from colonialism. They became these intermediaries, these middlemen for Western capitalism, which ultimately perpetuated a new form of colonialism, what we call neo-colonialism.
So even though these countries had achieved political independence, they remained economically dependent on their former colonizers, which Fanon saw as a huge obstacle to genuine liberation.
And what's striking is how Fanon's warnings about the pitfalls of national consciousness seem to have been borne out in many post-colonial African nations. I mean, think about the corruption, the nepotism, the power struggles that have plagued many of these countries.
Yeah, and some scholars argue that even the transition to majority rule in South Africa, while a monumental achievement in ending apartheid, could be seen through this lens of neocolonialism.
Right, because while the political system changed, the underlying economic inequalities largely remained in place.
So Fanon was increasingly disillusioned with this national bourgeoisie. He started to see the peasantry, the rural working class, as the real force for revolutionary change. He saw them as less corrupted by Western influence, more connected to the land, and more likely to push for a radical restructuring of society.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of Fanon's personal and intellectual journey up to this point. But the way scholars approached his work began to shift, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. That's when we see this turn towards those postmodernist and postcolonial interpretations we talked about earlier.
This shift really picks up steam with Homi Bhabha's influential foreword to a new edition of Black Skin, White Masks, which was actually Fanon's first book. And scholars like Ato Sekiotu were doing really important work in this area as well.
And this is where things get really interesting. Postmodernists and postcolonial thinkers, they're interested in power dynamics, in how identity is formed and shaped, in the role of language and discourse in perpetuating systems of oppression. And they're finding a lot of rich material in Fanon's work to engage with.
It's like they're taking Fanon's ideas and applying them to a whole new set of questions and contexts.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that we see a kind of shift in focus within Fanonian studies. The Fanon of The Wretched of the Earth, the revolutionary theorist, he's still important, but there's this growing interest in the Fanon of Black Skin, White Masks, the writer who grappled with the lived experience of race and racism.
So the focus is shifting from the grand political narratives of decolonization
Yeah.
to these more personal, psychological, and cultural aspects of colonialism and its legacies.
Right. And as PLE Idahosa points out, Fanon's ideas are starting to resonate beyond the specific context of Third World liberation struggles. He's being seen as a thinker whose insights speak to issues of identity, representation, and the complexities of power that are relevant globally.
Yeah, and even David Macy, in his biography of Fanon, he acknowledges this shift in focus. He links it to the rise of post-colonial studies as a field in itself.
Okay, so let's delve a bit deeper into Idahosa's work because he offers some really valuable insights into the second generation of Fanonian scholarship.
In his book, The Populist Dimension to African Political Thought, he compares Fanon with other key African thinkers, like Amilcar Cabral and Julius Nyerere. And his main argument is that these thinkers, even though they were writing in the context of the 1950s and 60s, are still incredibly relevant today.
Because the fundamental problems they were addressing, those issues of inequality, dependence, the struggle for self-determination, those haven't gone away. They've maybe even intensified in some ways.
Yeah, and he points out that Fanon was unique in that he wasn't just an academic writing from afar. He was actively involved in the Algerian Revolution. He saw firsthand the complexities and the violence of the struggle for liberation. That experience really shapes his writing.
And Idahosa frames Fanon's thought within this interesting framework of nationalism and populism. He argues that for Fanon, achieving national independence was important, but it wasn't the end goal. It was a means to an end.
So it wasn't just about replacing a white colonial elite with a black national elite. It was about truly empowering the people, especially the most marginalized.
Exactly. And as a populist thinker, Fanon was acutely aware of class divisions. He saw the peasantry, the rural masses, as the real driving force for revolutionary change. And he believed that the state was only legitimate if it served the interests of these people.
He was also really concerned with the question of development. He was searching for an alternative to the Western model of capitalist development, which he saw as inherently exploitative. He believed that Africa needed to chart its own path, drawing on its own unique history and cultures.
He was calling for new ideologies, new institutions that were genuinely geared towards the needs and aspirations of the African people.
And Idahosa argues that both Fanon and Cabral saw the peasantry as the key revolutionary class. They also emphasized the crucial role of culture in any meaningful transformation.
Right. It wasn't just about changing economic and political structures. It was about a cultural revolution, a transformation in the very way people thought and saw the world.
Okay, so now let's turn to Nigel Gibson's book, Fanon, The Post-Colonial Imagination. Gibson, as the title suggests, situates his analysis of Fanon squarely within postmodernist thought.
And Gibson makes this important point. Fanon's understanding of the colonial world was nuanced and complex. He wasn't just presenting a simple good guys versus bad guys narrative. He was grappling with the deep psychological and cultural impacts of colonialism, how it shaped both the colonizer and the colonized.
And a key concept for Gibson, one that's really important for understanding Fanon, is the idea of the dialectic of experience.
Right. This is the idea that the lived experience of resisting oppression, of fighting for liberation, leads to a profound transformation in consciousness. It's not just about achieving external change, it's about a fundamental shift in how people see themselves and the world around them.
So it's not just about getting rid of the colonizers, it's about decolonizing the mind, breaking free from those internalized ways of thinking that have been imposed by the colonial system.
Exactly. And Gibson emphasizes the importance of understanding Fanon's own personal experiences. He was a Martinique man who was educated in the French system, he experienced racism in France, and then he became deeply involved in the Algerian Revolution. All of these experiences shaped his thinking.
Gibson argues that Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Masks, is a brilliant example of him weaving together phenomenology and psychoanalytic theory. He was drawing on thinkers like Hegel, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty to analyze the lived experience of race and racism.
He was trying to understand how the experience of being Black in a white-dominated world shapes one's sense of self, one's identity.
And he makes this crucial observation that Black people often struggle to gain genuine recognition and respect from white people within the existing power structures. This lack of recognition, Fanon argued, leads to the development of Black consciousness as a way of asserting one's humanity, one's right to exist and be seen.
So it's about reclaiming agency, about defining oneself on one's own terms, not on the terms dictated by the colonizer.
And Gibson explores a lot of other key themes in Fanon's work: the psychological effects of colonialism, the complexities of Black identity politics, the issue of revolutionary violence, and Fanon's vision of a new humanism in a post-colonial world.
One thing that really concerned Fanon, as Gibson points out, was what he saw as an absence of ideology in many newly independent African nations. He felt that there was a lack of a clear vision for the future, a lack of a guiding set of principles for how to build a just and equitable society.
So it wasn't just about getting rid of the old colonial structures. It was about creating something new, something better, something truly liberating.
Exactly. And his project was about more than just achieving political independence. It was about creating a new kind of human being, one who was free from the psychological scars of colonialism. He famously talked about the need to create a new man.
And Gibson concludes that Fanon's legacy lies not so much in providing concrete solutions, but in formulating these crucial questions, these challenges that we're still grappling with today. He sees Fanon's post-colonial imagination as this ongoing provocation, this call to think critically and creatively about how to build a more just and equitable world.
Okay, now we need to bring in a very different perspective, one that's much more critical of Fanon. This is David Macy's biography, Frantz Fanon biography. This is a massive, meticulously researched book, but it takes a very different approach than the works we've discussed so far.
Macy really digs deep into the historical context of Fanon's life. He gives us all these details about the events that shaped Fanon's world, his early years in Martinique, his experiences in France, his involvement in the Algerian Revolution. But unlike the other writers we've looked at, Macy seems much less sympathetic to Fanon.
He seems to be on a mission to debunk the Fanon myth, to sort of cut him down to size. He's critical of Fanon's personality, his intellectual rigor, and his political judgments.
Yeah, and his take on Fanon's views on violence is particularly confusing. He initially calls Fanon an apostle of violence, but then he later acknowledges that Fanon personally hated violence and that he saw it as a tool, a last resort in the struggle for liberation. But then he concludes by saying that Fanon had this talent for hate and that he advocated for a level of violence that Macy himself can no longer justify.
It's kind of all over the place.
Yeah, it's a very contradictory portrayal.
And Macy also tries to undermine Fanon's credibility as a psychoanalyst. He basically says that Fanon was a good psychiatrist, but he wasn't a properly trained psychoanalyst. And therefore, his writings on psychoanalysis, especially in the colonial context, are somehow less valid.
But that seems to contradict what Alice Churkey tells us, right? She was both a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. She worked closely with Fanon, and she recognized his deep understanding of the unconscious mind and his ability to apply psychoanalytic theory to the colonial situation.
Exactly. Macy also dismisses Fanon's journalism as mere polemic, saying that it lacked a real understanding of the complexities of the Algerian War. And he's critical of Fanon's political judgment, particularly during his time as an ambassador for the Algerian government in Ghana.
He basically accuses Fanon of being naive and of putting too much faith in certain African leaders.
And he's not much kinder to Fanon's books. He says that a dying colonialism is overly idealistic, and he criticizes The Wretched of the Earth for being poorly researched and full of generalizations.
And perhaps most controversially, Macy casts doubt on Fanon's character. He implies that Fanon was prone to exaggeration and even makes these unsubstantiated claims about his personal life, hinting at some kind of dark secret without providing any real evidence.
Which is really problematic. It feels like he's trying to smear Fanon's reputation without any real basis.
And what's ironic is that Macy himself makes some factual errors in his biography. He gets some basic facts wrong about African history and geography, which undermines his own credibility as a meticulous researcher.
So you have to take his critique with a grain of salt.
It's interesting, though, that both Churkey and Macy, despite their very different perspectives on Fanon, they both briefly mention the Algerian Civil War of the 1990s and early 2000s.
Ah, yes, that horrific conflict. It's often called a dirty war because of the brutality and the widespread human rights abuses that were committed by both sides.
It's estimated that over 200,000 people died in that conflict. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it was manipulated and fueled by a corrupt military junta that wanted to hold on to power.
What's especially disturbing is the continuity between the tactics used by the Algerian army during that war and the tactics used by the French during the War of Independence. It's like the colonial patterns of violence were just replicated within a new context.
And I think this is where Churkey, Gibson, and Macy miss a crucial point. The violence of the Algerian Civil War, the state-sponsored terrorism, the torture, the massacres, that was completely different from the kind of revolutionary violence that Fanon was talking about.
Right, Fanon was talking about of violence directed at the colonial system, at the structures of oppression. He was not advocating for violence against one's own people.
Exactly. And the actions of the Algerian military during that civil war are a perfect example of what Fanon warned about in the pitfalls of national consciousness. He was deeply concerned about the potential for the national army to become an instrument of oppression rather than liberation.
So, in a way, that civil war was a tragic fulfillment of some of his worst fears.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at different interpretations of Fanon, his key ideas, his strengths, his weaknesses, his relevance to the challenges facing post-colonial societies. But where do we go from here? What can we learn from Fan? What can he teach us about building a better future?
Well, I think Idahosa offers some of the most hopeful and constructive insights in this regard. He really emphasizes Fanon's call for a new kind of thinking, a new set of ideas and institutions that are genuinely grounded in African realities.
He reminds us that Fanon was calling for Africans to break free from the mental shackles of colonialism, to stop imitating Europe, and to create something new, something that reflected their own unique history and culture.
He famously said, "Europe has done what it had to do, we must do what we have to do." And in his final book, The Wretched of the Earth, he urges Africans to invent new concepts, to create a new man who is free from the legacies of colonialism.
So it's about moving beyond those old binaries of colonizer and colonized, of white and black, and forging a new path based on justice, equality, and a deep respect for human dignity.
And Idahosa highlights Fanon's belief in the transformative power of youth and women. He saw them as key agents of change. And this connects to the ideas of other African thinkers like Julius Nyerere and his emphasis on self-reliance as the basis for development.
And Idahosa points to a new generation of African scholars who are carrying on this intellectual project of seeking alternative paths for Africa. Thinkers like Daniel Osabukli, Claude Ake, Muniwa Muyu, and Guy Martin.
They're all grappling with these questions of how to build just and equitable societies in a world that's still shaped by the legacies of colonialism and global power imbalances.
So Osabukle, in his work, he argues for a form of democracy that's grounded in African culture and traditions. He sees this as the key to achieving genuine and sustainable development. He even proposes the creation of an African high military command and a system of education that's rooted in African history and values.
Claude Ake, he offered a very critical perspective on the post-colonial African state. He saw it as often serving the interests of a small elite rather than the majority of the population. And he called for a more participatory democracy, one that gives real power to the people, combined with a development strategy based on self-reliance.
And then you have the Fundiwa Africa paradigm, developed by Muniwa Muyu and Guy Martin. They take a long-term historical perspective on African state formation, and they emphasize the importance of autonomy, self-reliance, control over resources, and a focus on meeting the needs of the African people.
They also see youth and women as crucial agents of change, and they envision a future where African nations unite in a federation based on shared values and a common vision for the future.
So you see, Fanon's legacy is complex and multifaceted. We've got Macy, who offers a very critical and often contradictory portrait, but also acknowledges Fanon's anger and generosity. We have Turkey, who emphasizes Fanon's relevance for understanding the ongoing struggles against violence, racism, and fundamentalism. Gibson highlights Fanon's powerful ability to formulate those key questions that we're still wrestling with. And Idahosa points to Fanon's role in opening up this space for thinking about alternative paths to development and liberation, not just for Africa, but for the world.
It's worth remembering Fanon's own words. In Black Skin, White Masks, he said, "I want to be a man who questions." And in his last letter, he stressed the importance of fighting for justice, liberty, and the cause of the people.
So as we conclude this deep dive, I think the challenge Fanon leaves us with is this. How do we continue to ask those difficult questions? How do we keep pushing for a better future, a more just and equitable world, one where everyone has the opportunity to live a dignified and fulfilling life?
Fanon's work, even decades later, continues to provoke us, to challenge us, and to inspire us to imagine and create a different kind of world. And that's something worth reflecting on.
Absolutely. So until our next deep dive, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a better future.